By the time the lanterns came on in Livesay's mill, the sky over Greenbrier County had already turned the color of coal dust. Wind rolled down off the hills, shouldering through bare branches and chimneys, and the valleys settled into that particular winter silence where every sound seems to travel twice as far. In the forge at the edge of the village, Erasmus Trout Shoe stood with his sleeves rolled back, forearms shining with sweat, staring into the open mouth of his fire. The steel inside it glowed a furious orange. He should have felt only satisfaction, a man's contentment in honest work. But his thoughts were not in the forge. They were 3/4 of a mile away in a narrow 2-story house, where a young woman with dark hair and stubborn eyes spent most of her days now lying down, one hand on the swell of her belly. "Andy," he called without looking up. From the back of the workshop came the scrape of a broom on grit, the small, eager movements of an 11-year-old boy trying very hard to be useful. The helper popped his head around the partition, cheeks chapped red from the cold. "Yes, sir." "Run to the house. Tell Mrs. Shoe I'll be later than I thought." Erasmus kept his eyes on the changing color of the metal. "Ask if she needs anything fetched. Flour, coal, medicine. You stay if she says you're needed. You hear?" "Yes, sir." The boy darted out, the door banging once in his wake. A wind knifed into the warm shop, scattering sparks in the air before the door thudded closed again. Erasmus set his jaw and turned back to the forge. A last-minute order for horseshoes had come in from a farmer whose mare favored one leg. That meant another hour at the anvil, at least. He ought to have been thinking about the shape and balance of the iron, the rhythm of hammer and tongs, but his mind kept sliding away to Zona. They had not told the town yet, not in any formal way, that she was carrying a child. The doctor had advised caution. "She's not strong," he'd said, frowning, fingertips pressed together. "Let us see how she fares before you go spreading joy." Joy. That was what it had been at first. Zona Heaster, 23, free-spirited, more untamable than any horse he'd ever shod, had been like a sudden streak of color in his graying life when he first came riding into Livesey's mill the previous autumn. She'd grown up on a farm not far from the river, under a sky that changed with the seasons, but never with her circumstances. He'd watched her bargaining with a trader in the road that first week, chin lifted, dark eyes bright, the hem of her dress muddy from the fields. She had looked at him once, only once, and it had been enough to crack something open inside his chest. He was older, 35, with lines at the corners of his blue eyes and the quiet, inward manner of a man who had lived a long time among his own mistakes. He did not speak about his first 2 marriages. One had ended with the word abuse, hushed like a curse behind closed doors. The other had ended under a falling brick from a chimney he'd been mending with his wife on the roof. Greenbrier County did not know these things when he arrived. Livesey's mill only saw a tall, capable blacksmith with steady hands and a willingness to work. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, had looked at him and seen something else. She had stood stiffly at the Heaster fence that first Sunday afternoon when he came calling, arms crossed over her apron, watching the way her daughter's face softened. "You're too old for her," she had said when Zona went inside for tea. "And you're new. Men who arrive full-grown out of nowhere always bring something with them." He had smiled, polite. "I bring a trade, ma'am. A future." "And what do you leave behind?" she'd asked. He had no answer ready, and Mary Jane had not trusted him ever since. None of that mattered to Zona. Stubbornness in her ran like iron through ore. By November, a mere few months after that first startled glance in the road, she and Erasmus had stood before a minister and spoken their vows. They rented a little house together near the foot of the hill, close enough that the river's low winter mutter could be heard on sleepless nights. Not long after, Zona began waking pale and sick, clutching her belly in the mornings. The doctor came and went, leaving small brown bottles and quiet warnings. "You rest," Erasmus would tell her, smoothing her hair back from her forehead, a tenderness in his touch that no one in town would ever think to question. "Let me do the worrying." Now, in the forge, he pulled the half-molten iron from the coals and set it on the anvil. The hammer rose and fell, metal singing under each blow, sparks fountaining in the dim. Outside, the light leaked slowly out of the valley. He told himself the boy would soon be at the house, that Zona would smile her tired smile at being fussed over, that everything was, if not safe, at least as it had been in the morning. He told himself this until the lies felt almost like facts. He had no way to know that by the time the hammer struck its fifth blow, the forge and the house and the quivering line of his own life were already pulling in two different directions. The boy's breath puffed in front of him as he trotted up the narrow lane toward the shoe house, the heels of his boots knocking small shells of ice off the ruts in the road. The wind cut through his jacket, and he hunched his shoulders, thinking of the warmth he'd left behind in the forge and the warmth he would soon find again at the shoe stove. Mrs. Shoe always had a kind word for him, sometimes an extra piece of bread if there was any to be spared. She spoke quickly, laughed easily, and made him feel, in a way his own mother's tired gentleness could not, that he was part of the larger moving world. The gate creaked when he pushed it. That was normal. Everything creaked in winter. The front steps groaned under his weight as he ran up them. He knocked on the door with the knuckles of both hands, breathless but pleased at being entrusted with such an adult errand. Silence. He frowned, knocked again. Mrs. Shoe was always bustling, peeling potatoes, sweeping, straightening things that did not need straightening. Even when she was laid up in bed, he could hear her humming sometimes through the thin wall when he walked past after dark. "Mrs. Shoe," he called. "Ma'am?" No answer, no footsteps, no muffled thud. Only the wind outside, and faintly, the river. He hesitated, then tried the latch. The door swung inward without resistance. The house smelled of cold air and banked coal. It was dark inside, no lamps were lit, though the daylight was already thinning. He stepped over the threshold cautiously, the boards cool under his boots. "Mrs. Shoe?" His voice sounded small in the unlit room. He moved further in, eyes straining to adjust. The familiar shapes of table and chairs grew out of the gloom. He could not shake the feeling that he was trespassing, doing something grown men did as a matter of course, but which, for him, felt like a kind of quiet crime. He heard nothing. No rattle of pots, no low murmur of someone upstairs. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. "Sir sent me," he called, as if that somehow gave him permission. "He said to see if you was all right." He turned toward the staircase that rose at the far side of the room, the narrow flight that led up to the bedroom where Mrs. Shoe often lay resting. At the foot of the stairs, where the last step met the floor, something broke the straight line of shadow and wood. At first, his mind did not arrange the shape into anything meaningful. It was only a darker patch in the dim, a bundle of cloth, perhaps. His feet carried him closer before his understanding caught up. Zona lay on her back across the bottom of the stairs, perpendicular to them, as though she had slipped and come to rest there. One arm was folded neatly across her chest, the other stretched along her side. Her skirts were smoothed around her legs. Her head tilted slightly to one side, long dark hair falling around her shoulders. For a terrible, hopeful second, he thought she was asleep on the floor like a child who has sunk to the ground mid-play. "Mrs. Shue?" he whispered. He went down onto his knees beside her. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing. Her chest did not rise. Her lips had a faint bluish tinge, like ice along a well. He reached out a hand, almost touched her shoulder, snatched it back, heart hammering against his ribs so hard it hurt. Something was wrong with the way her head lay against the floor. It did not seem quite right. The angle was subtly, horribly off, a detail his frightened mind recorded, even as it refused to name it. He scrambled to his feet, stumbled backward, then turned and ran, lungs burning, out of the house, down the front steps, through the yard. He did not close the door behind him. The house stood open to the cold, and the wind moved through it as if it had been hollowed out. By the time he burst into his own home, choking on sobs, he could hardly form the words. His mother took one look at his face and grabbed his arms. "Andy, what is it?" "Mrs. Shue," he gasped. She's on the floor. Mama, I think she's dead." His mother did not let herself react in front of him. She turned his shoulders, pushed him back toward the door. "Go," she said, voice sharp with urgency. "Run back to the shop. Tell Mr. Shue to get home. I'll fetch the doctor." Grief has its own way of arranging a village. Within an hour, there were boots on the path to the Shue house, low voices on the porch, lanterns moving like slow fireflies against the coming dark. The doctor arrived last. By then, neighbors had filtered through the house, whispering in the narrow hall, in the kitchen, some standing in the yard in clumps, hats in their hands. The boy's mother had guided people away from the staircase and sent a cousin to tend the stove. Death required organization. Someone to make tea, someone to close doors, someone to remove their hat when they forgot. Erasmus had come home like a man stunned by a blow that has not yet started to hurt. He barely remembered leaving the forge. 1 minute he was striking iron, sparks leaping. The next, his helper stood before him, white-faced, words tumbling out in a rush of terror. The hammer had slipped from his fingers. The forge fire had seemed to dim all at once, as though it were drawing breath with him. At the house, they tried to stop him at the door, to give him time. But grief does not recognize propriety. He pushed past, up the stairs, and then there she was on the bed, no longer at the foot of the stairs, but laid out on the quilt. Someone having moved her with a care that made him both grateful and enraged. She looked very small. He sat beside her and gathered her head into the crook of his arm, smoothing her hair with shaking hands, rocking slightly as if the motion could coax her back into herself. "Zona," he whispered over and over as the light faded from the window. When the doctor came, he took in the scene in a single glance. The husband bent over his wife like a penitent. The neighbors hovering, the raw sound in the room, something between sobbing and the wind. He had seen the young woman like this before, pale and trembling on her pillows, but always with a pulse in her throat and a faint smile when he made some mild remark to ease her worry. Now there was nothing in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Trout," he said softly, using the nickname everyone in the county knew, though never to Erasmus's face. He approached the bed, laid a hand on the blacksmith's shoulder. "I need to examine her, to—" The man did not move, his fingers threaded into Zona's hair. "Erasmus," the doctor said more firmly, "let me." Slowly, as if each inch of movement cost him something, Erasmus lifted his wife's head and placed it on the pillow. He smoothed her hair carefully around her neck, making certain it lay thick and dark over the whiteness of her throat. Then he knelt beside the bed, so close his sleeve brushed the coverlet, hands still in her hair, his bent head almost touching hers. From this angle, the doctor could not easily see the line of Zona's neck. He told himself it did not matter. A fall down the stairs would explain much. A weak heart, made weaker by pregnancy, could explain more. Her body was cool beneath his fingers, cooling. He checked her chest, her belly, the slackness of her limbs. Heaven knew she had been ailing for weeks. It would not be the first time he wrote childbed complications on a piece of paper for some woman taken too early. He felt, beneath the clinical motions, a hollowing sadness. He thought of her laughing weakly on his last visit, one hand on her belly. "It'll all be worth it, won't it, doctor?" she had said. "All this sick feeling." "It will," he had told her. "Rest." Now there would be no child, no mother. "Likely the pregnancy," he murmured at last, half to himself, half to the room that had grown so quiet. Heart gave out. She was never robust. Behind him, Erasmus made a sound that had no words in it. The doctor did not insist on a longer examination. There was something in the husband's posture, a possessive intensity, the way he hovered at the head of the bed, that made pushing further feel indecent. He stepped back. In the gathering dim, it was easy not to notice what he had not seen. The funeral took place the next day at the little hilltop cemetery that overlooked the valley where the river curved like a dull knife. The ground was hard, the men's shovels ringing against frozen clods. Women's skirts snapped in the wind. The minister's breath fogged the air as he spoke. Word had spread quickly. Death, marriage, scandal. These things traveled fast along the dirt roads connecting farms and church and store. The rumors had raced ahead of the mourners. She had been pregnant. She'd been found at the foot of the stairs. She'd never been strong. She'd never been right since marrying that blacksmith. Erasmus stood by the open grave, fists clenched so tightly the skin over his knuckles shone white. When they carried the coffin past him, he reached out and laid his palm flat on the wood, as if to anchor it. He had insisted, before they closed it, on placing a scarf around Zona's neck, a soft length of cloth in a pattern she had liked. He smoothed it carefully, tucked it so it lay snugly at her throat, covering the delicate line of her skin. To anyone watching, it was a tender, heartbreaking gesture, a husband trying to give his wife one last comfort against the cold earth. Mary Jane Heaster watched with eyes that did not soften. She had not wanted this marriage, not from the first. She had known long before anyone else the way her daughter's laughter sounded when it was forced, the way Zona had started avoiding her gaze after certain visits as though hiding bruises of the soul, if not the skin. Now she stood at the edge of the grave and watched the man who had taken her daughter's hand, her house, her future, place a scarf on the body as if he had the right. Her face showed no grief, only a thin-lipped, controlled hatred that made some of the neighbors, glancing at her, look away in discomfort. They told themselves, everyone grieves differently. A mother's anger is understandable. Still, it was strange, that lack of tears. The minister spoke of dust to dust, of God's mysterious will. The wind snatched at his words. Erasmus's shoulders shook with sobs, unrestrained, his grief like an exposed nerve. Some of the mourners felt, in the shallow parts of their hearts, an unkind irritation. His weeping was so loud that it seemed to drown out even the minister's consolations. When the time came to lower the coffin, he leaned over it one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the wood. But whether to the woman within or to someone else entirely, even he could not have said. The ropes creaked, the coffin sank, earth began to fall in dull thumps. Mary Jane turned away before the grave was half filled. She did not stay to receive the murmured sympathies of neighbors. She did not clasp hands or bow her head to their words. She walked down the hill alone, face pale, eyes fixed on some point ahead that no one else could see. Behind her, in the raw air, Erasmus' shoe howled like a man whose whole life had finally caught up to him. For the next weeks, the rhythm of Livesay's mill adjusted itself around an absence. The shoe house became a place people looked at sidelong when they passed, then looked away from. The forge fire burned later again. Erasmus went back to work almost at once, because work was the only thing that did not crumble when touched. Mary Jane's house, further out along the road, became a quieter sort of landmark. At first, neighbors came to the door with pans of food and murmured condolences. They knocked, waited, frowned at the silence. Sometimes they heard footsteps inside, the scuff of movement, but the door did not open. Once a cousin peered through the front window and saw Mary Jane pacing the bedroom, candles all around her, lips moving. She's praying, they told themselves. Of course she's praying. Her only daughter is dead. But the praying did not stop. Night after night, as the town banked its fires and shutters were drawn against the cold, light burned in Mary Jane's upstairs window. Someone riding past late on an errand might glance up from the road and see her silhouette moving back and forth, or kneeling beside the bed, hands twisted together, her head tilted in that peculiar way of someone who is listening very intently for something that has not yet happened. Her husband began sleeping in the barn. When he did come into the house, he avoided talking about her strange vigil. To those few who asked, he gave a tight, embarrassed smile. "She's taking it hard, is all," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She prays. I give her the space." Some afternoons, Mary Jane was seen outside, walking along the lane. Her hair, once neat, was loose. Her dress seemed to hang off her as if she had forgotten to adjust buttons. She muttered to herself constantly, words too low to catch, eyes flicking to either side like someone certain she was being followed. "Mary Jane?" A neighbor might call gently. She would startle, refuse to meet their eye, and hurry away. People worried. People gossiped. They said grief had cracked her mind. They said she had always been high-strung, that this was merely the final turn of the screw. Only one thing about her behavior remained consistent. Whenever anyone mentioned Erasmus's name in her hearing, her face tightened, jaw clenching, eyes hollowing out with a hatred that had, if anything, sharpened since the funeral. Something is wrong, she thought, over and over, pacing by candlelight. Something is wrong beyond the fact of my daughter's death. But the only person who could tell her what it was lay in the ground on the hill, unless she didn't. The thought came into her slowly at first, like a seed on the wind. It grew in the dark spaces of her broken sleep. In the daytime, it seemed foolish. You cannot simply call the dead back and demand explanations. The minister would call it blasphemy. The doctor would call it hysteria. At night, under the watch of the candles, it felt like the only sane idea she had. If God would not give her answers, perhaps her own child would. And so she began to pray, not for comfort, not for acceptance, but for visitation. "Zona," she whispered, knees aching on the bedroom floorboards. "Zona, come. Tell me what happened. Come if you can, child. Show me." The words looped through her like breath. Days blurred into nights. She ate little, slept less. Observers saw only a woman unraveling. They did not see how the edges of her perception were changing, how the silence itself was beginning to seem charged, like the air before lightning. In the middle of February, almost 4 weeks after the funeral, something answered. It was late. The candles in Mary Jane's room had burned low, gutters of wax cooling in uneven rivers along their sides. The house was quiet around her, the noises of the night outside muffled by the walls. She knelt, as she always did, at the foot of the bed, hands clasped so tightly her nails dug crescents into her palms. "Zona," she said, lips barely moving. "Zona, please." The temperature in the room changed first. It felt as though someone had opened a door to the winter air outside, but no draft stirred the curtains. The hairs on Mary Jane's arms stood up. She drew in a breath that burned with cold. Then, in the center of the room, between the bed and the wardrobe, a light began to form. It was no lamp glow, no reflected moon. It started as a small, dense point, too bright to look at directly, then swelled outward in a pale, radiating sphere. The shadows of the furniture stretched long and strange, thrown at odd angles. The chill deepened, sharp as river ice. Mary Jane's first instinct was to flee. Every old story she'd been told as a child about spirits and warnings and the dangers of meddling with the unseen rose in a chorus in her mind. Her body tried to scramble backward, but her knees stayed rooted to the floor. "This is madness," she thought distantly. "You prayed for this, and now you're terrified you might get it." The light pulsed once, twice, and then went out. The room snapped back into ordinary dimness. The air warmed slightly, as if someone had closed an invisible door. Mary Jane remained kneeling, chest heaving, eyes wide in the after-images. Nothing moved. No ghost stepped out. No voice whispered. Only the faint crackle of candle wicks. It would have been easy, then, to tell herself she had imagined it. A vision born of exhaustion and frantic hope. But the memory of that bone-deep cold, of the way the shadows had bent, clung to her. It did not feel like imagination. It felt like the line between worlds, thinning for a heartbeat. She slept not at all that night. The next 2 nights, the light returned. Each time it appeared in the same place. Each time it brought with it that unnatural chill. Each time it vanished without resolving into anything she could speak to. It was not kind. It did not console. It simply arrived and crept through her bones and went away. By the 4th night, Mary Jane was half mad with anticipation. When the cold began to gather, she was already kneeling, hands shaking, eyes fixed on the center of the room as if willing something to form there. The light bloomed, harsh and pale, and this time it did not simply swell and wink out. Something stepped out of it. Later, in the prosecutor's office, she would say she saw her daughter. The figure was the right height, the right shape. It wore a black dress Mary Jane remembered seeing Zona in, the cloth hanging straight and still despite the strange current in the air. The skin of the face was very pale, the eyes dark hollows. Hair fell straight around the shoulders, heavy and unbound. The ghost, if ghost it was, stood staring at Mary Jane with a gaze so level that it felt, for a moment, like an accusation. Fear surged up in Mary Jane so violently she almost choked on it. She wanted to scramble backward, press herself into the wall, close her eyes, but another voice inside her, louder than the fear, said, "You asked for this. Don't run now." She forced herself to hold the figure's gaze. "Zona," she whispered. Her voice shook. "Is it you?" The figure did not answer. Its bare feet made no sound on the floorboards as it began to move forward. Mary Jane's back encountered the wall. The plaster was cold through her thin dress. She realized she was gripping the hem of her skirt in both hands. She had rehearsed, in her head, 1,000 clever questions. Ask if she's at peace. Ask who did this. Ask about the baby. In the burning reality of the moment, all those rehearsals shriveled. Only one question remained, simple and raw. "How did you die?" For a moment, nothing moved. Then the figure stopped a few feet in front of her. Its pale face shifted. the features tightening as if some memory were being pulled up from a deep place and forced into the light. When it opened its mouth, what came out first was not words, but a spill of coarse, dry dirt that pattered soundlessly onto the floor. Mary Jane squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them again, fighting the urge to scream. The voice that followed was low and rough, like sound dragged over stones. "He was not what you thought," it said. It told a story. In halting phrases, punctuated by small silences in which the chill in the room seemed to deepen, the ghost described a marriage that had turned tight and mean behind closed doors. The man who smiled at neighbors in church, who bent courteously over his forge, raged at home over small slights, a mislaid tool, an offhand remark, a dish not to his liking. "He hit me," the voice said without emphasis. "He shouted. You did not see. I did not tell you." Mary Jane's throat closed around an apology she did not know how to speak to the dead. The night before the body was found, the ghost said, Zona had made supper. She was tired. Her back ached. She had not eaten much herself. Erasmus came home hungry, in a mood that had already sharpened into something ugly by the time he opened the door. He had wanted meat, a specific cut he had mentioned that morning. Zona had forgotten. She had cooked something else. He was angry, the ghost whispered. He pushed the plate away. He said I did not listen. He said I did not care for him. I tried to tell him I would make whatever he liked. There was still time, but he did not want words. In Mary Jane's mind, she could see it too clearly. The small kitchen, the cheap dishes, the lamplight laying down wavering shadows. Her daughter's hands still red from the cold pump water. She could see Erasmus rising to his feet, the scrape of the chair, the sudden, coiled violence in his movements. He put his hands on my neck, the voice said. At that, the figure's eyes widened, the dark hollows seeming to deepen as if they looked past Mary Jane and into some place only it could see. The expression on its face shifted from distant recitation to something like naked, recalled terror. The room changed with it. The air pressed inward, pulling at the shallow pockets of warmth around Mary Jane's body. It felt as though all the oxygen were being sucked toward the open mouth of the figure in front of her. The candles flickered, their flames bending as if in a wind that blew from all directions at once. The ghost's feet left the floor. Very slowly, as though hoisted by some invisible rope, it began to rise. Its arms hung limp at its sides, black sleeves draping, its head tilted back, throat bared. Mary Jane heard, with sick clarity, the sound of a neck straining, of tendons pulling taut. Then there was a sharp, cracking noise, loud in the small room. The head spun around, too far, all the way, until the pale face looked backward, over the ghost's own spine. The body, still oriented toward Mary Jane, hung twisted, a grotesque inversion of any posture a living person could take. Mary Jane did not faint. The horror held her too tightly awake for that. She stared, unable to look away, as the figure slowly sank back down to the floor, its skirts settling. Now that its body had turned, its backward-facing head was once again oriented toward her, and it was smiling, not kindly, not cruelly, only with a thin, knowing curve of the mouth that seemed to say, "Now you understand. Now do you see what he did to me?" The voice asked, the words low and clear. Then the figure stepped backward into nothing and was gone. The cold snapped, the room warming as if someone had shut a window. The candles righted themselves. The shadows crept back into their ordinary corners. Mary Jane remained where she was for a long time, breathing in sharp, ragged pulls. Her hands had gone numb. Her knees ached. Her mind ran in circles around the single image of the twisted neck, the backward-facing smile. It could have been a dream, she thought briefly. A vision conjured by grief and suspicion. But even as she considered that, her body knew better. Dreams did not leave one's muscles trembling like this, did not change the very feel of the air. Besides, the ghost had told her something she had not known before, not in any precise way, that the husband's hands had been at her daughter's neck. She slept at last, because the body can only bear so much. In the morning, she rose with a clarity she had not felt since before the funeral. She washed her face, braided her hair, put on a clean dress. She blew out the candle stubs in the bedroom, opened the curtains, and stepped out into the bright, brittle February light. The neighbors who saw her that morning noted the difference immediately. Her back was straight, her hair neat, her eyes no longer sliding restlessly from side to side, but there was a hardness in her expression that made them step aside without quite knowing why. She did not stop to chat. She did not look up at the hill where the cemetery lay. She walked, with a purpose that seemed almost physical in the air around her, to the prosecutor's office. She did not knock. She opened the door and stepped inside. The county prosecutor knew Mary Jane Heaster as everyone did, a practical farm wife, not given to flights of fancy. He had heard the stories of her strange behavior since the funeral, and had filed them privately, under grief beyond bearing. When she strode into his office without invitation, he set down his pen with a little jolt. "Mrs. Heaster," he began, "I'm very sorry. We need to talk about my daughter," she said. And there was something in her voice that silenced him. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She did not sit. Instead, she told him, standing, the story from the funeral to the vision. She spoke for nearly 2 hours. At first, he listened with the professional patience of a man enduring an outpouring he could do nothing about. The words ghost and spirit made his jaw tighten. He thought of ministers, not of exhumations. But as she talked, other details threaded between the supernatural claims began to pull at him. The scarf at the funeral. The way Erasmus had insisted on arranging her hair around her neck during the doctor's examination. The fact that there had been no proper post-mortem, that they had all accepted pregnancy complications as sufficient explanation because it was tidy and spared everyone a more painful narrative. "You say," he interrupted once, "that her head turned." Mary Jane's mouth pinched. "Yes." "And that you saw his hands at her throat?" "In the vision, yes. In the way she showed me." He almost said, "That is not evidence." What he said instead, thinking of the way the doctor had, in passing, mentioned feeling that something had been off, was, "You understand, I cannot bring a case on the testimony of a spirit." "I understand you can dig," she said. "If I am mad, you will find nothing. If I am not mad, you will see his hands in her neck." The stark logic of it lodged in him. Her grief might have conjured the ghost. It might have conjured, instead, a hyper-focused attention on details others had overlooked. Either way, the path she pointed to, exhumation, re-examination, was one the law could walk without acknowledging the unseen at all. When she left, having given him names and dates and the exact wording of the question she had asked the apparition, he sat alone in his office for a long time. The ink in his inkwell formed a thin skin he did not break. Finally, he rose, put on his coat, and went to the doctor's house. At first, the physician bristled. "I examined her," he said. "She was dead. It was the pregnancy. I told you as much." I know what you told me, the prosecutor said quietly. What I'm asking is whether you saw her neck. The doctor opened his mouth to say, yes, of course. What kind of question is that? And then stopped. Memory is an uncertain companion, but certain images come back with a sudden, guilty clarity. Erasmus at the head of the bed. Erasmus's hands in his wife's hair. The scarf at the funeral, tied a little too high under the jaw. I don't recall in detail, he admitted slowly. It was all very emotional. I did not insist on moving her head. The prosecutor did not mention ghosts. He did not mention cold rooms and backward-turned faces. He spoke instead of due diligence, of the responsibility they carried to the living and the dead alike. The doctor's shoulders slumped. If you wish to exhume, I will attend. The next day, men with shovels stood at the top of the hill, their breath clouding the air. The prosecutor watched as dirt was thrown aside, the rhythm of the shovels both laborious and oddly soothing. The coffin emerged from the ground like a dark, sodden box of secrets. They took it, with grave care, to the local schoolhouse. It was one of the few buildings with enough open space and light for the examination. The doctor now knew he should have performed the first time. Inside, the wooden desks had been pushed to the walls. The coffin lay on a trestle table. The doctor, the prosecutor, and a handful of witnesses stood around it, hats off, faces solemn. When they opened the lid, the cold from the earth rushed out in a breath. Despite the weeks in the ground, the body inside was better preserved than any of them had expected. The winter soil had kept its own vigil. The scarf was still wrapped around Zona's neck. The doctor's fingers trembled slightly as he untied it. Beneath the fabric, the skin of the throat bore dark, irregular marks, as if someone with strong hands had gripped it hard. The bones under the flesh felt wrong beneath the probing touch, loose where they should have been firm, gritty where they should have met cleanly. The windpipe showed damage no fall down a short flight of stairs would have caused. The doctor and the prosecutor looked at each other over the still body, their expressions almost identical mixtures of shock and grim recognition. It was not the ghost that convinced them. It was anatomy. Evidence, once found, has a way of pulling more evidence to it. When they arrested Erasmus Shue, he protested innocence with wild vehemence, then sullen silence, then sudden bursts of self-pity that made the jailer shift uncomfortably in his chair. Word of the exhumation flickered through the valley, catching on tongues eager for any story that set ordinary life aside. Stories of his past marriages surfaced, carried by letters and relatives and the kind of cousins who remembered everything. One former wife, still living, had divorced him for cruelty. Another had died in what had been called at the time a freak accident, a brick dropping from a chimney they were repairing together, striking her head. The new context made that brick feel heavier in the retelling. At his trial, Erasmus sat stiffly, his strong hands folded on the defense table, the tendons in his neck corded. He had a lawyer. He had the presumption of innocence. What he did not have, despite the absence of a straightforward motive, was an explanation that fit the marks on Zona's throat and the history that unfurled behind him like a shadow. The prosecution, careful not to hinge their case on the supernatural, nonetheless called Mary Jane Heaster to the stand. She walked up the aisle between the benches with the same straight-back determination she had carried into the prosecutor's office weeks earlier. In the gallery, people leaned forward. She stated her name, her relation to the deceased. The lawyer asked, with judicious care, about her suspicions, about her daughter's marriage, about the behaviors she had seen and those she had only felt. Then, like a man stepping carefully out onto a partially frozen river, he asked her about the dream. Did anything unusual occur in the weeks after your daughter's death that influenced your decision to come forward? He said. Yes, she said. My daughter came to me. The defense lawyer objected. The judge, after a brief, muttered discussion at the bench, allowed the testimony with a cautionary remark. It was not offered as proof of the facts, he reminded the jury, but as explanation of the witness's state of mind and the path she took to the authorities. Within those constraints, Mary Jane told her story. She spoke of the prayers, the candles, the cold light, the figure, the twisting neck. The courtroom, rendered suddenly very small by the words, held its breath. No one shuffled. Even the men who scoffed inwardly could not keep from seeing, as she spoke of it, the image of the backward-facing head. Her voice did not tremble. Whatever fear she had felt on that fourth night had been burned into a certainty that had hardened rather than fractured. Did you, Mrs. Heaster, the prosecutor asked, believe what you saw? Yes, she said simply. And did you go to the authorities because of it? Yes. The defense attempted to make her look foolish, to paint her as an overwrought woman given to visions. They asked pointed questions about how much she had slept, about whether she knew that dreams could feel very real indeed. I know what I saw, she said each time. Not obstinate, merely steady. The jury listened to the rest of the evidence. The position of the body when the boy found it, the marks on the neck, the dislocated vertebrae, the crushed windpipe. They listened to the stories of Erasmus's past wives. They listened to his own testimony, in which he shifted from earnest denial to anger to an almost sullen self-pity, never managing to align these moods into a portrait of a man deeply wronged by a terrible error. In the deliberation room, they did not, perhaps, speak much of ghosts. They spoke of patterns, of bruises, of hands. They spoke of Mary Jane's unwavering conviction, which could be taken as madness or as the clear sight of someone who had finally found words for what she had felt from the beginning. When they returned, the verdict was guilty. Shue was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife, Zona Heaster Shue. He would not serve the full term. 3 years later, a mysterious illness passed through the prison, taking him with it. No one in Greenbrier County marked the date with more than a quiet, inward acknowledgement. The law wrote, exhumation, physical evidence, history of abuse, and its records. The town wrote something else in the softer, unwritten ledger of memory, that a mother had listened so hard for her dead daughter's voice that either the dead spoke or her own mind arranged the truth into a form she could not ignore, and that because she acted. A man who had hurt women before could not do so again. Years turned. The valley changed in small ways. New roofs, new fences, the slow alteration of family names as marriages and deaths did their weaving. Children grew up hearing the Greenbrier story in whispers. The woman whose ghost had come back to point at her own throat. The man whose past had caught up with him in a schoolhouse and a courtroom. On a patch of ground not far from the cemetery where Zona lay, a plaque was eventually set in place. It named her. It named the year. It named the fact that this was the only known case in which testimony from a ghost had helped convict a murderer. The metal letters caught the sun on certain days. Passers-by could stop if they wished and read the words, standing with their backs to the hill where the dead lay under snow or grass, depending on the season. Some would smile, a little skeptically, at the notion of a ghost on the witness stand. Some would feel, as they stood there, an odd tightening around their own throats, as if the past were closer than they liked to think. Some would remember a mother's long vigil in a small, cold bedroom, and how grief, sharpened by instinct, had refused to accept the story it had first been given. The grave on the hill remained quiet. The house where the Shoes had lived fell eventually to other tenants, then to disrepair. The forge cooled and cooled, the last sparks disappearing into ash no one would ever sift. Yet on winter nights, when the wind came down off the mountains and rolled through the trees and chimneys of Greenbrier County, there were those who would wake with the sudden, irrational certainty that something unseen had moved through their room. A chill, a pressure, a sense of being watched. And think just for a second of a woman in black, her head turned too far, asking a question whose answer had already, long ago, broken one man's life open. Whether a ghost ever truly stood at the boundary between worlds and implied, with a turned neck and a thin smile, a husband's guilt, the law could not say. But a mother believed it. A jury, hearing both spirit and bone, answered. And somewhere between those two truths, one written in stone, the other in the flickering light of candles long extinguished, the Greenbrier ghost still walks, if only in the minds of those who stand before the plaque and wonder what they themselves would dare to listen to if the dead they loved demanded to speak. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.